Welcome, RTO Superheroes, to another episode of our podcast. Today we have a special episode where the tables are turned. I'm thrilled to introduce our guest, Lauren Hollows. Lauren is an educational visionary and a passionate advocate for building better education systems and services. She is the founder of Anywhere Education Services, and she's dedicated to providing quality, compliant, and accessible assessment tools to educators. With a wealth of experience in business coaching, team development, resource development, and RTO compliance, Lauren excels at identifying ways to improve and streamline processes within the educational sector. She is passionate about using education to make a difference, fostering staff engagement, and enhancing business maturity. Lauren is also the driving force behind Learning Lifelines, a not-for-profit organisation aimed at closing the digital divide and providing equal education and economic opportunities. She believes in the transformative power of education. Today, Lauren will be wearing the interviewer's hat and will be asking me about some of the exciting developments and challenges in the vet sector. So without further ado, let's dive in.
Hey guys, this is Lauren Hollows for NOI Education Services, and I'm very fortunate to be continuing our series on assessment for the new RTO standards in our Roundtable series with Angela from Vivacity and Maree from Compliance Assist. So guys, we did briefly touch on in our last episode 1.3, which was all about testing. Recommend that you guys go and watch that episode. It'll be linked here, somewhere like that. I'm interested to get into some of the language that they talk about in the principles of assessment, rules of evidence, because the actual principles themselves haven't really changed. We've still got the same terms. However, it's interesting to see the way that they've changed, or I guess elaborated on what they are, like on how they've described it. So for example, when we have things like, fairness, taking into account the learner's need, including reasonable adjustment, and where appropriate, enabling reassessment if necessary. I think that some of those little changes there are quite interesting, particularly when we look at it across different environments. Like when we look at it from a financial perspective, if we look at reassessment as an example, in the CRIPOS environment, that's often charged at a fee. Is there some wiggle room there? Like what happens when an RTO is not enabling assessment because of the financial needs of the learner? Does that meet in with the fairness and equity that we've got now very much built into these standards? I'd be interested to get your kind of initial thoughts on principles of assessment, rules of evidence, and some of the specific language that has been brought into those. Angela, if you want to kick us off.
Okay, thank you. So when we look at this standard, or this clause in particular, is foundational in fostering an inclusive learning environment. And I think it ties into some of the other standards that we have, some new ones that we've got, which is now we've got disability, we've got First Nations that are also in there, and then we've also got some changes to support services and things like that. I think that's where this is going to tie in, is with those other new clauses that we have. That's going to be the major change from my perspective, and much more focus on those rules of evidence and principle assessment, and how they do, how you have adjusted your training and assessment in back to what I said in the last episode about your learner cohort and who is defined within your training and assessment strategy. So I think it's more of how are we identifying our learners' needs and then adjusting that training and assessment to meet their needs. And I think those other clauses are going to come in that are around support services. So that's my perspective.
Absolutely. Maree?
Yeah, my thoughts on it, Lauren, are the fact that this in the previous version of the standard itself was, simply conduct according to, these rules of evidence and principles of assessment. This standard now actually is very, and then sorry, in the previous, it was then you go to the guide to see what those, a definition or examples of what those particular principles assessment rules of evidence, actually are, or examples of. This has now got the actual rules and principles of assessment in the standard itself. And for me, that is a fairly significant change. So it's actually specifying, I look at 1.4A3 just as an example, and it says, validity. So the principle of assessment, validity, is the assessments of skills and knowledge is integrated with practical application and would enable the learner to demonstrate these skills and knowledge in similar situations. Whoa, straight away, that one to me is a bit very prescriptive in terms of there is an expectation of, that principle of assessment is really about, integration of knowledge, integration of skills and application in a variety of contexts, etc. So now the actual principles of assessment are not just a heading of fairness, flexibility, validity, because these words are actually now in the standards themselves. So that would be what you're looking at if you were coming along to audit, not simply the information that was user guide. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, and what I'm hearing from both of you is that obviously, both of you have spent a lot of time digesting the new standards as a whole. And I think that, this standard, what I'm hearing from both of you is that kind of with this standard, it's not so much the changes within the particular language of this standard. We think that principles of assessment, rules of evidence, they are what they are. They're integral to our industry. But taking that into account now in terms of the larger standards, in terms of equity and well-being, and a stronger focus on training and, a stronger focus on like contextualization and really thinking about and considering learners, that's probably more where this particular standard. So, your policy as such might not change, but a renewed focus on, for RTOs, on, do my tools really meet the needs of my cohort? Do we have processes that allow for that to occur? And then when we then take that to the next point, how do RTOs, if I'm an RTO and I'm looking at all of this and I know I've got to be compliant with all of this from 1/1/25, what are some of the pieces of evidence that I need to start collecting? What are some of the process changes that I need to be making in order to account for that? What's your advice to RTOs who are looking at this and kind of going, okay, but what does that practically mean for me in terms of my assessment tools and things like that?
One thing that I find very interesting within this, so if we look at 1.4b, assessors make individual assessment judgments that are justified based on the following rules of evidence. It's more of a focus on the assessor now, not just the RTO.
The assessment.
Yeah. So I think there's going to be a lot more responsibility on the assessors when it comes to these standards now. And I think that's really going to tie in with the workforce development plan and having that in place as well, and the responsibility of trainers and assessors when it comes to workforce development. This is actually saying now the assessors are responsible for the assessment judgments, which should have always been that way, but it's actually clarified now within the clause.
And I think, Angela, that even goes to, 1.4a, that assessment is conducted in a way, not that the assessment system itself, it's that it is actually conducted in a way that is consistent with these principles.
And more onus on the assessor.
On the actual process, on the practice of it, as opposed to the tools, the methods, etc. Yeah. And I think that by putting the words, rather than just saying is consistent with, with the principles of assessment, of fairness, of flexibility, I think that the standard is trying to actually really spell out the interpretation of fairness, the interpretation of flexibility, the interpretation of validity, and reliability, obviously, to go, well, it's not a choose your own adventure as to what you think these principles mean. Yeah. Here is what we mean by the principle of fairness. Because otherwise, because they've put those words into a legislative standard, as opposed to previously having it as the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence in the legislative standard, and then you have how are they interpreted in a guide. Now it's actually saying, no, this is the interpretation of it. Don't come up with your own. Here's the one that we're giving you.
So I'm really interested in how ASPA will interpret this as well, when they write the user guide.
You think that I guess one of the interesting components, just from an operational perspective on this, is how, there has been a separation over the years of compliance and trainers and what their duties are and what their responsibilities are. Do you think that in your interpretations of this, one of the focuses for this year for RTOs does need to be looking at having processes where trainers can be more integrated into the design and feedback process, and also potentially really an upskilling of trainers as well, to go back to, helping trainers to really understand their units, to really understand, what the principles of assessment are and how that looks, and what the rules of assessment, what the rules of evidence are and how that looks. In my opinion, I still think, every year I do a series on the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. And it's because every year it continues to be an area where, trainers come to me and they go, one side goes, I still really don't understand this. And then the other side goes, I'm really frustrated because I know I have a responsibility on these tools, but our processes are such that I can't have any say in. So, how do you, what advice do we give to RTOs and to trainers in those situations to kind of go, well, this is kind of going to be a way that you're going to have to negotiate that. And you've got the next, 10 months to kind of really bring that in and make some changes to your organizational, structure and culture as to how that's all going to work.
Yeah, well, I've been teaching every year. I deliver a workshop on assessment validation and explain the rules of evidence and principles of assessment. And it is an area where there is a lot of non-compliance. It has been historically. So it's not just trainers and assessors understanding, it's also the RTOs understanding how they work. And the way I explain it is we have our unit of competency, then we have our rules of evidence and principle assessment, and they all layer over each other. And we use the rules of evidence and principle assessment to identify whether we're delivering the unit of competency to meet those requirements. So it's really looking at the unit of competency, breaking down the performance criteria and saying, in our assessment tool, are we valid? Are we reliable? Are we meeting the requirements of the rules of evidence and principle assessment? And I think once people see it as it's an overlay, it's not separate, it's an overlay of the performance criteria and the assessment conditions within the unit, then they're able to get a better understanding. And that's how I explain it to trainers and assessors. And I think now moving forward with the new, and you can start doing this now, but moving forward with the new clauses, trainers should be taking that into consideration while they're conducting assessment, training and assessment, and how are they applying that in their delivery of their training as well as conducting their assessments, and start thinking about how do the rules of evidence and principle assessment overlay and interlay into that unit of competency. Maree?
Yeah, no, I cannot disagree. And I think it sort of takes a step back into in our previous session, we were talking about that testing. And that sort of whole concept of, testing, and I think that sort of talks to it as well. You've got to understand what the principles are. You've got to understand what the rules of evidence are. You've got to understand what the actual requirements, the training package are, in order that you can go, well, is this going to work? Is this going to make sure that, the evidence I collect is going to be, what I need it to be, or that it's being done in such a way that, it's fair and it's equitable and it's flexible and all the rest of it. And can I be flexible? And I think that, that whole testing process is so critical to this process. And, the number of times, to be honest, I've picked up an assessment at an RTO and thought, I haven't got the first clue what it is I'm supposed to be doing. As a learner. So, I like to put my learner's, shoes on and go, well, I can't work out what am I supposed to be doing? Or how on earth am I going to do that? Or, and then I put my assessor's hat on and go, I can't figure it out either.
Conduct it.
Yeah. So how on earth can I conduct it? And then, Lauren, the point that you were making is that business about, we've tested these tools because, 1.3 is about testing the tools, and it specifically says tools. And then we come down to 1.4, where we're actually talking about conducting the assessment. And, again, this is one of the things that comes up repeatedly, the assessor who you go, well, hang on a minute, but this tool says this, but you've done something completely different. Oh, yeah, that didn't work. I couldn't get that to work, or, they couldn't understand, whatever. So making that consistency between them as well. And assessors understanding that you're going to be conducting this. Can you? Your learners, can you actually do this? Because if not, we need to step back to 1.3 again, and go, well, hey, this doesn't work. It doesn't achieve what I need it to achieve. But you're not authorized to just go ahead and just, choose your own adventure and do it yourself. So yeah, I think that, again, this is an area that has always been problematic, and I'm not sure how much it's improving, to be honest.
Yes, it will be very interesting to see how we're going to be audited against this, and what will be different. It was interesting, Lauren and I at the last VELB conference actually spoke to some of the auditors, the ASPA auditors, and they didn't know how they were going to interpret it, because they had actually, the people that we spoke to said it's so ambiguous, all of the standards, they don't know how they're going to be auditing against them. Particularly, so a lot of the changes in the standards was to break it down for big and small RTOs. So it's ambiguous because of that, because it's going to be different for a different size RTO. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think it's going to be more of an onus on the trainer and assessor to be taking into consideration what are the rules of evidence and principle assessment, not just on the RTO. I think it's the trainers really thinking about how am I applying the rules of evidence and principle assessment whilst I'm delivering my training. Is going to be, instead of just validation, we're validating and we're integrating, it should be in their day-to-day delivery of their training and assessment. How am I applying this?
Thank you for joining us at the RTO Superhero Podcast with me, Angela Connell-Richards. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast on your preferred podcast app. Each rating and review helps me fulfill my goal of helping training organisations around Australia to learn and grow in compliance and business success.